Hello everyone, today I will present about foundation of behavioral and experimental economics. In this presentation, there will be 6 chapters. First, introduction, and then foundation of experimental economics, foundation of behavioral economics, summary, Nobel laureate test profile, and references. We will begin the presentation with introduction. Economics was widely regarded as a non-experimental science that had to rely on observation of real-world economies rather than controlled laboratory experiments. Today's research increasingly relies on new data from laboratory experiments rather than on more traditional field data, that is, data obtained from observations of real economies. Human decision-making deviates in one way or another from the standard assumptions of the rationalistic paradigm in economics. Early studies of alternative market mechanism by experimental economists can be viewed as tests of the hypothesis of idiosyncratic deviations from standard economic theory. Early studies of human decision-making by cognitive psychologists can be seen as testing hypotheses of systematic deviations from rationality. On the second chapter, I will present about foundations of experimental economics. Traditionally, economics has been viewed as a non-experimental science that had to rely exclusively on field data. Many perceive this an obstacle to the continued development of economics as a science. Economics cannot perform to the control experiments of chemists or biologists because it cannot easily control other important factors like astronomers or meteorologists. It generally must be content largely to observe. Under controlled laboratory conditions, experimentalists study human behavior in situations that, in simplified and pure forms, mimic those encountered in markets and other forms of economic interaction. Historically, in 1984, Chamberlain attempted to test the neoclassical theory of perfect competition by way of experiments. In 1994, Reinhard Shelton conducted early experimental studies of price formation in oligopoly markets. Jones do early studies on the predictive power of game theory in an experimental. While in 1960 and 1963, Siegel and Froker reported experimental results on bargaining. The main researchers in the experimental tradition is Vernon Smith. He made the most important early contributions and remained a key figure in experimental economics. Next, I will explain about foundations of experimental economics on market mechanism. Vernon Smith's most significant works concern market mechanism. Smith's first experimental article on 1962 was inspired by Chamberlain's. Chamberlain regarded his experimental results as a facilitation of standard neoclassical model of a market under perfect competition. Smith realized that Chamberlain's result would be more compelling if the participants were placed in setting more similar to a real market. Smith set up an experiment with subjects were divided into groups of potential sellers and buyers in a so-called double oral auction, a market mechanism used in many financial and commodity markets. Here you can see the Smith's experiment result on market mechanism. Smith concluded that there are strong tendencies for a competitive equilibrium to be attained as long as one is able to prohibit collusions and to maintain absolute publicity of all bids, offers, and transactions. Changes in key conditions of supply and demand cause changes in the volume of transactions per period and the general level of contract prices. This latter correspond reasonably well with the predictions of competitive price theory. Later experiments continued to confirm Smith's original result. Plot and Smith on 1978 obtained the same general result, but added an important twist. Market institutions do matter. In almost any market experiment, a clear test of the hypothesis in question requires controlling for the subject's preferences. This problem was first addressed by Chamberlain in 1948, essentially by providing the subjects with the right monetary incentives. This so-called induced value method was developed further by Smith in 1976 and has now become a standard tool in experimental economics. Next, I will explain about foundations of experimental economics, tests of auction theory. Auction theory has emerged as one of the most successful developments in microeconomic theory and game theory since the early 90s. Smith pioneered the use of controlled laboratory experiments as wind tunnel tests of new auction designs for which precise theoretical predictions are hard to obtain before they are used in practice. Central to Smith's experimental work on auctions are the established theoretical predictions for certain auctions form used in the sale of a single object, traditionally classified into four types: an English or ascending auction, a Dutch or descending auction, the first price sealed bid, and the second price sealed bid auction. Microeconomic theory also distinguishes between auctions with private and common values. In both cases, the value to each buyer is treated as random variable. Economic theory makes the following three predictions in the case of private values. First, English and second price auctions are equivalent in terms of who will probabilistically obtain the item and the expected revenue to the seller. Second, Dutch and first price auctions are equivalent, a result which follows from the more restrictive assumptions of Nash equilibrium behavior, that is, individual rationality combined with interpersonally consistent expectations. And the third, all four auctions form are equivalent if all buyers are risk neutral, that is, if they are indifferent between participating in an actuarially fair lottery and obtaining the expected lottery price for sure. Smith carried out many experiments, once more controlling for demand and supply conditions, while varying the market institutions in order to empirically test this and other theoretical predictions. One of the most unexpected results was that Dutch and sealed bid first price auctions turned out to be unequivalent. Two theoretical explanations have been suggested. One is that utility depends not only on the monetary outcome but also on the suspense of waiting. In the Dutch auction, the other that bidders underestimate the increased risk associated with waiting in the Dutch auction. Next, I will explain about the laboratory as a wind tunnel. Smith as well as Plot initiate the use of the laboratory as a wind tunnel in order to study the performance of proposed institutional mechanism for deregulation, privatizations, and the provision of public goods. In a series of studies, Smith studied the design of incentive-compatible mechanism for the provision of public goods. In this experiment, Smith tested the effectiveness of mechanism proposed by economic theorists and as well as some of his own variants. Next, I will explain about experimental methodology. Smith's seminal American Economic Review article, Experimental Economics, Induced Value Theory, provided a practical and detailed guide to the design of economic experiments in the laboratory and a motivation for these guidelines. The experimental method developed by Smith deviates from the experimental approach used in psychology. It emphasized the importance of providing subjects with insufficient monetary incentives in order to get outweighed the distorting effects of decision scores. Smith methods also emphasize the importance of designing experiments as repeated trials, so that the subjects can become familiar with and understand the experimental situation. Smith's approach to experimentation constitutes a vital contribution of relevance not only for economics but also for other social sciences. In 1954, Edwards introduced decision-making as a research topic for psychologists, outlining an agenda for the future research. In 1953, Elias outlined a psychology-based positive theory of which choice under uncertainty. Later on, in 1956, Simon proposed an approach to information processing and decision-making based on bounded rationality. Continued by Kahneman and Tversky, in 1996 published their findings on judgment and decision-making. In this third chapter, I will explain about foundations of behavioral economics, decision-making, and economics and psychology. Economics typically assume that market behavior is motivated primarily by material incentives, and that economic decisions are governed mainly by self-interest and rationality. In psychology, especially cognitive psychology, a human being is commonly regarded as a system. Economists have traditionally treated a decision maker's preferences over available alternatives as fixed and given. The decision maker is assumed to form probabilistic beliefs or expectation about the state of nature and the states of her actions, and to process available information according to statistical principles. Cognitive psychologists consider an interactive process where several factors may influence a decision in a non-trivial way. These components include perceptions which follow its own laws, as well as beliefs or mental models for interpreting situations as they arise. Intrinsic motives such as emotions, the state of mind of the decision maker, and attitudes, stable psychological tendencies to relate to a given phenomenon in one's environment, may influence the decisions. Extensive behavioral evidence collected by Kahneman and others through surveys and experiments calls the assumptions of economic rationality into question. A number of studies have uncovered a non-trivial amount of deviations from traditional model of rational economic behavior. Next, I will explain about foundation of behavioral economics, judgment under uncertainty, heuristics, and biases. Kahneman and Tversky discovered how judgment under uncertainty systematically departs from the kind rationality postulated in traditional economic theory. Kahneman and Tversky's early research is that people in general are frequently unable to fully analyze situations that involve economic and probabilistic judgment. Human judgment relies on certain shortcuts or heuristics which are sometimes systematically biased. One fundamental bias is that individuals appear to use a law of small numbers, attributing the same probability distributions to the empirical mean value from small and large samples, thereby violating the law of large numbers in probability theory. According to the statistical laws of large number, the probability distribution of the mean from a large sample of independent observation of a random variable is concentrated at the expected value of the random variable, and the variance of the sample mean goes to zero as the sample size increases. According to the psychological law of small numbers, by contrast, people believe that the mean value from a small sample also has a distribution concentrated at the expected value of the random variable. This leads to over-inference from short sequences of independent observations. Another bias common in probabilistic judgment is availability, whereby people judge probabilities by the ease of conjuring up examples. Kahneman's research questioned the empirical validity of one of the fundamentals of traditional economic theory. Next, I will explain about foundations of behavioral economics, decision-making under uncertainty prospect theory. Available evidence indicates that not only judgment, but also decision-making under uncertainty departs in a systematic way from traditional economic theory. Departures from the von Neumann, Morgenstern, Savage, expected utility theories of decisions under uncertainty were first pointed out by the 1988 economics laureate Maurice Allais. Kahneman has provided extensive evidence of departures from the predictions of expected utility. One striking finding is that people are often much more sensitive to the way of outcome differs from some non-constant reference level than to the outcome research in absolute terms. People appear to be more adverse to losses relative to their reference level than attracted by gains of the same size. Tversky and Kahneman in 1992 estimated that the value attached to a moderate loss is about twice the value attached to an equally large gain. Kahneman and Tversky moved beyond criticism, however, and suggested an alternative modeling framework in their seminal article, Prospect Theory, an Analysis of Decision Under Risk, in 1979. Tversky and Kahneman in 1986 argued that two theories are in fact required: expected utility theory to characterize rational behavior and something like prospect theory to describe actual behavior. Kahneman's results have provided researchers in economics with new insights and have been instrumental in subsequent model buildings by alerting decisions analysis to the errors commonly committed by real-life decision makers. A further extension by prospect theory known as cumulative prospect theory. And now, here we comes to the summary. Daniel Kahneman. He has used insights from cognitive psychology regarding the mental process of answering questions, forming judgments, and making choices, to help us better understand how people make economic decisions. Daniel Kahneman worked with Tversky on decision-making under uncertainty clearly stands out as the most influential. He also made early contributions to other areas of behavioral economics. While Vernon Smith, he is the figure in launching experiments as an empirical methodology in economics. He tested alternative hypotheses regarding market performance, in particular the importance of different market institutions. He has also emphasized methodological issues, developing practical experimental methods and establishing standards for what constitutes a good experiment. A current wave of research draws on the combined traditions of psychology and experimental economics. This new research is potentially significant for all areas of economics and finance. A challenging task in financial economics is to consider the extent to which the effects of systematic irrationality on assets prices will be weeded out by market arbitrage. Although Kahneman's and Smith's research agendas differ in many respects, their combined scientific contributions have already changed the directions of economic science. And these are our Nobel laureates profile: Daniel Kahneman and Vernon Lomax Smith. That's the end of my presentation, and thank you for watching.